Hey everyone, it's Miles again. The playtest I mentioned in the last video went well, but it's been a busy few weeks altogether, so I'm just getting the video out now. So I'll first go over what I did, and then I'll talk about how the playtest actually went and what I learned from it. First of all, I implemented a timeout system, so that if the game gets no input for a while, it will first show this text telling how to reset the demo manually, and then eventually it will reset back to the beginning of the overworld, all on its own. That way I don't have to constantly watch over the demo and manually reset it whenever someone walks away in the middle of a chapter. Speaking of which, this demo's hub world is much simpler than the previous hub world. The last demo was thrown together haphazardly at the last minute, and was pretty much just a collection of all of the random levels that we already had laying around. It had levels for teaching the basic mechanics, for teaching the color mechanic, for the Wonderland mechanic, and for the ghost blocks. But it also had 3 different collections of miscellaneous levels, 2 different types of procedurally generated levels, a weird artsy narrative level, and multiple Easter eggs, which was frankly just too much disparate content. These were distributed around the edge of a floating island of sorts that was supposed to look natural and organically shaped, but in retrospect just looks like a hot mess. And what's worse, while the first and second level sets were close together in the overworld, the third set was so far away from the second that it was completely off-screen when you first spawned back in after completing the second set. So virtually everyone just put down the controller at that point after having played for only a few minutes. They probably didn't even realize that there was more to the demo. So this time I simplified down to 4 chapters, each teaching one central mechanic laid out right next to each other in a dead simple hub world that fits entirely on one screen. This way the focus is squarely on testing each chapter and its mechanic. Before I go through the chapters, I guess I should probably talk about spoilers. The lion's share of the enjoyment of a puzzle game typically comes from the process of actually solving the puzzles. So, given that some of the levels that I'm making now may very well make it into the final game without much modification, and especially since that will only become more true with time, I think I'll try to avoid directly explaining the solution to any difficult puzzles from now on, unless I have a really compelling reason to do so. I mean, the last thing I would want is for somebody's experience of the game itself to be dampened just because they watched the devlogs. That would be pretty self-defeating on my part, I think. However, any really straightforward tutorials or otherwise just non-puzzle levels are totally fair game for explanation. Now, as for the chapters, the basic tutorial levels haven't changed much. I don't want to try to fix what isn't broken, but these signs are a new addition. Previously, this tutorial text would appear in the top left corner of the screen in levels that needed it. This was fine for information that players needed immediately in order to progress. When they got stuck and didn't know what to do, they'd look around the screen and eventually find the prompt telling them what they needed to know. But for non-essential information, for example, teaching the player about an alternate way to control the camera, which is very useful but not immediately necessary, they would be too focused on solving the level and would just miss the text entirely. However, a sign right near the start of the level is impossible to miss, and we teach players early on that signs contain important information. In fact, the very first thing the player sees when they boot up the game is a sign telling them how to move. So in this way we can virtually guarantee that the player never misses an important bit of instruction. I'm sure this seems obvious to experienced game designers, but because Escher is my first project of this kind of scope, I'm stumbling across these sorts of problems for the first time. I'm finding them really interesting, so I wanted to share my thought process. Now, unlike the basic tutorials, the color-based levels got completely redone. It seems like people just didn't quite understand the mechanic last time, and we've changed how it works in some cases since then, so the tutorials would have to be retaken anyways. One valuable game design lesson I've learned in general is that crafting good tutorials is as much about dismissing misconceptions the player might have as it is about just giving them correct information. So, for example, because all of the basic levels only have green blocks in them, it would be easy to think that green or non-green blocks are somehow special, when in reality the thing that matters is just the difference between block colors, not the colors themselves. So green blocks are just an aesthetic default and don't behave differently from any other block color. To teach this, I made one level to introduce the basic idea that you can't cross virtual connections between differently colored blocks. And then that level is immediately followed by another which is completely identical, except that the color palette has been swapped out, to show that the same idea applies regardless of what specific colors are used. Then throughout the rest of the color-based levels, I try to use a variety of color palettes, most of which don't include green at all, to really let the player soak in that idea. These tutorials still need more refinement before I can be happy with them, especially to teach some of the new, interesting but counterintuitive shadowing behavior, where, because the game's rules are based only on what's visible from a given view, if one block fully covers another, it will essentially replace the other block's behavior with its own, which is hard to grasp at first. But these new levels were already a big improvement. Probably the biggest change in this demo was to the falling blocks. Previously they could only fall downwards, but I realized with the game being what it is, there's no particular reason why this has to be the case. So now they can fall in any direction, and that's indicated by an arrow imprinted on the side of the block. This opened up a bunch of new and interesting behavior. For example, these one-way platforms that you can freely walk around on until you get out to the very last block, at which point each one begins to fall away in sequence as you come back. Or this clever level made by my friend Phil that relies on this ring of falling blocks all mutually falling in on each other. Or the fact that two opposing falling blocks will become permanently stuck wherever they meet, which can require manipulation of the level to make sure that they meet in the right place. I'd actually like to expand this mechanic even more, and I have a few ideas on how I might do that, which I'll get into in a future devlog, but it's already proving to be one of the more interesting things in the game. Finally, the ghost block levels. This mechanic has been probably the most difficult one for players to understand, and also the most difficult one for me to convey as a designer. The central idea is that you can turn a virtual connection into a physical one, which looks exactly the same from the current view, but once you rotate the camera, you can see that they've moved. This is interesting because it introduces a degree of fungibility to the distinction between physical and virtual connections, which is central to the entire game. But it also poses a fundamental challenge to conveyance because, if the level geometry looks exactly the same before and after, then how is the player supposed to understand what exactly changed? Or, how will they even see that something has changed in the first place? I previously implemented this camera swing, which I think helps a little bit, but the feedback I got was that this still doesn't make it sufficiently clear what's happening, so I'll be looking at ways to further clarify this mechanic. Now, let's finally talk about how the playtest actually went. I actually set up OBS to make a screen recording of the event, both so that I could review and analyze it later, and also so that I'd have real footage of people playing through the levels for the first time that I could use in this devlog. Unfortunately, it turns out that OBS has some trouble with recording things that are full screened on macOS, so instead I now have about 3 hours of this. Lesson learned, I suppose. I'll test my setup more thoroughly before the event next time. Overall, this demo had fewer level sets than the last one, but each chapter had more levels, and the levels are a bit more difficult and involved, so it balanced out to a similar amount of content in the end. Despite this, people played for a lot longer on average. Nobody was able to make it through the entire demo, but at least one person got close. And regarding the speed at which people are able to get through these levels, I think I might need to fundamentally change my outlook. Up until now, I've had some idea in my head that if someone spends too long on a given level, especially one that isn't too terribly complicated, then there must be something wrong with the level to cause them to get stuck. Of course, it seems obvious in retrospect when I say it like that, but I really can't properly design a puzzle game with that mentality, and I think this playtest made that clear to me. For example, there were some levels that people breezed right through, but didn't really seem to understand, and then there were some that people got stuck on for a long time, but once they finally found the solution, the reaction was something like, "Oh, okay, I can't believe I didn't see that," or, "Oh, of course, that's what I was missing," or even, "Huh, yeah, I guess that makes sense actually," which are exactly the kind of reactions that I want. Of course, it can still be painful to watch somebody struggle with a puzzle that you already know the solution to, but when I think about other puzzle games that I know are good, I realize maybe that's just how the genre is sometimes. It can be okay, I think, for a player to struggle with a level for a long time, as long as they feel that the solution was fair. So I should be looking at how playtesters feel once they've finished a puzzle, rather than placing so much weight on how long it takes them to get there. Another thing that I've noticed whenever I've demoed Escher at an age-inclusive event is that little kids seem surprisingly drawn to the game. I mean, call me prejudiced, but I generally imagine kids that age as being exclusively interested in things with some combination of cartoon characters, superheroes, slapstick humor, or at least some, good old-fashioned pyrotechnics. So for them to be interested in a sort of weird, minimalist, quiet, serious puzzle game like Escher is really unexpected. I mean, to be clear, they're not any good at it. They have to be walked through basically every level, no matter how easy. But even so, their parents sometimes have to practically drag them away when it's time to leave. Actually, from seeing such a wide variety of people play Escher over the course of the year or so that it's been in development, I've noticed an interesting and fairly strong correlation between player age and the ability to quickly understand the game. It seems like children below a certain age are more or less completely unable to learn the game, but around, I'd say, maybe 10 or 12 or thereabouts, people seem to very suddenly go from no ability whatsoever to being able to pick up the game faster than almost any adult. And from there, the ability seems to just steadily decline with age. My personal pet hypothesis is that the sharp incline in the graph probably corresponds to some specific stage of brain development during which people gain the necessary spatial reasoning abilities. And then once they have those, I would bet that it's primarily just limited by brain plasticity from there on out. But I'd love to get an opinion from like a developmental psychologist or something similar. Unfortunately, I don't know anyone with that sort of expertise personally, so I haven't really had anyone to ask. Well, that's about all I have for now. I've got what I think will be an interesting topic lined up for the next devlog, and after that, I guess we'll just have to see.